The year is 1949, and as superheroes are on the wane and other genres of comic books are rising. Which books were the most submitted to CGC from 1949? You might be a little surprises, but let's take a look up next on this video from Bronzeville Comics. Hello, panelologists. This is Jim from Bronzeville Comics coming to you with another video. And before we get started, please like, comment, subscribe. Check the description for the links to my whatnot, my Instagram, my eBay store, and my email. So any of those ways you can reach out to me. We've been doing this list for about 15 weeks. And every week we go 1 year into the future to the top 10 books most submitted to CGC in terms of blue labels. We're not looking at restored books. We're not looking at conserved or qualified or even signature series, just blue labels. That makes it simple. The data comes from CGC data, and it's easy enough to get the data, but then to aggregate all of this together and look at the books that are significant to talk about. We also look at the top books for all sorts of different publishers, which kind of puts things into context. And we also do a little bit of talk about the mean grade for those, for these Golden Age books. So one of the things that I think is interesting, we're going to dive into the top 10, but before we do that, I want to take a look at this graph. So what this graph is, starting in 1938, the blue at the bottom represents the number of copies needed to make the top 10, and the red represents the number of copies needed to get into the top spot. And one of the interesting things is, if we look at both of these for 1949, the number to get into the top 10 and the number to get into the top spot is the lowest since 1939. It's the lowest number for the 1940s. I mean, there's not a lot of differential as we get into the 40s, but with only 214 copies in the top slot and only 110 CGC blue labels to make the top 10, that is the smallest number. Comics are diminishing. I do have a couple of theories. A lot of comics aren't going to be graded in lower grades. There aren't a lot of huge keys in 1949, not a lot of first appearances anymore. The superheroes, again, were kind of going away. So there are less books submitted. And let's take a book like Batman. Issue number 50-something of Batman is going to be less valuable than a book in the single digits, the teens, the 20s, in terms of issue numbers. Now, we don't really talk a lot about values in these videos. That's a different story, but there is a link between the value of the book and the number of books that are generally submitted, right? Because if a book is more valuable overall, it's more likely to be submitted in lower grades, right? If a book is only worth $50 in a 2.0, probably not going to be submitted too often in a 2.0, but if it's worth $500 in a 2.0, it's going to be submitted in a 2.0, probably 1.0, maybe even a 0.5. So that's something to consider. I also think, and I have a theory here, is that by 1949, right, we're going to see on this list there is a connection already to The Seduction of the Innocent, Frederick Wortham, and all that sort of stuff. Now, Wortham was already fairly well known by this point, even though his book Seduction of the Innocent wouldn't be published until 1954. But he was known by this point in time. And we'll see that come up a little bit on the list. So that has something to do with it, because the books from the earlier part, let's say the World War II era books that have survived to this day. Listen, there were millions of copies, and now there are about maybe a couple hundred of these books in general. The ones that have survived to this day were already probably stored away, a lot of them, by 1949, because those collectors who originally collected them may not have collected them, been like active collectors in 1949, but they put away their childhood things. And, you know, there's certain parents, the mom, instead of throwing the stuff away, just kind of puts them in boxes and puts them in the attic when the kids go off to college or what have you. And they stayed there. The books from 1949 that were read by young kids, they were still kids as these this fervor started building towards the comics code, and they were thrown away. Right? If there were books in book burnings related to the seduction of the innocent Wortham stuff, they were in the hands of younger children rather than older teens or young adults, where those stuff was about. That's just a complete theory on my part. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below. But we're going to go into the top 10 list, right? So it only took 110 copies to make the top 10. So let's take a look at the books that did grab a spot on the list, and then we're going to take a look at a whole bunch of other keys and so on. Coming in tied for number 10 is 4-Color 223 from Dell. And this is another one of these 4-color books that are Carl Barks. Donald Duck stories are very popular with collectors. This is Lost in the Andes. Again, I've said this previous times. Carl Barks with Donald Duck, and often with his nephews, was doing these book-length adventure stories, which are still quite popular among collectors. They've been collected in reprint editions. Again, they're worth checking out. Carl Barks did the story and the cover of this book. 110 copies on the Census. This is tied with Planet Comics number 58. A Joe Doolin cover, but a really cool. It kind of has like an L.B. Cole vibe in terms of the colorings of it, and also a little bit of a Schomburg in terms of the composition, but it's Joe Doolin. Planet Comics from Fiction House, and it kind of has, this cool woman on the rocket ship. These Fiction House books, I think Planet Comics Jumbo and Jungle are the most popular, and really a lot of times it's related to the artwork, whether or not it's good girl art that you'll see on the cover, and also if it's popular cover artists. But these books seem to be available. I think that they were really taking a stronghold amongst kids that were looking for more science fiction, and for Planet Comics especially, and moving away from superheroes. Again, this was tied 110 copies on the Census. Let's move to familiar territory in 9th place, and it's Batman. Number 54. Again, a little bit of a we talk about the action-related Batman covers versus kind of the campier or hokier covers, and this is a little bit cheesier of a cover. This is issue number 54 with a cover by Win Mortimer and Charles Paris, where Batman and Robin are putting posters on a side of a building. Not really that exciting a cover, but again, it's Batman. Batman is the most popular book for collectors from this era, and that's still available. 118 copies of this book on the Census. If we go to number 8 on the list, more action-oriented cover of Batman, number 54. This is a Jim Mooney cover. Here, they're breaking in and catching these crooks who have just opened this package with a bat in it. I don't know if it's a real bat or a toy bat. It's hard to decide, but again, Batman, extremely popular. 128 copies of this on the Census. Number 7. This one's goofy. It's Batman number 51. It says Bob Kane and Charles Paris cover. I talked about, again, how much art actually Bob Kane did. But this is the wonderful Mr. Wimble. Don't lose your courage, Batman and Robin. I'm here to save you. And this kind of dumbfounded cowboy who has Batman and Robin hooked up to these targets and going to shoot them is going to be stopped by Mr. Wimble. This book has 131 copies on the Census. Moving right along, let's go to Superman. This is Superman number 61. It's a Wayne Boring and Stan Kay cover. And this is Superman being surrounded... the Superman for Lois Lane is a blonde, brunette, or redhead, or Lois Lane with wigs on. Again, not the most exciting action-packed cover, but, right after Batman, Superman is popular from this era. It does represent, a very strong corner of the superhero market and its history. There are 149 copies of this on the Census. And staying with the Man of Steel, this is a really cool one. This is Superman number 57, where... and this is kind of playing out now, Wayne Boring and Stan Kay cover, where Lois Lane gets Superwoman powers. Maybe it's Supergirl. Everybody was a girl back then, right? Doesn't matter how old the woman was. She was still a girl, right? it was a thing. And, you know, this is even before Mad Men. So, this is kind of a popular. It's the first time I believe that Lois Lane has superpowers. Lois Lane is Superwoman cover, and there's a Luther appearance. There are 159 copies on the Census. Then we go back to Batman, Two-Face cover appearance. This is it says Bob Kane cover, but I'm not going to necessarily believe that. It is a Two-Face cover. Batman number 50. And this is usually the other Two-Face covers. He's kind of very small because the distance here, he's front and center with his coin being flipped. There are 169 copies on the Census. Moving to number 3 on the list. And we finally get the Joker cover, Batman number 52. This is an action cover with the Joker driving the Joker Mobile. And this has a cover by Win Mortimer. More action to this cover. Joker's involved. Joker covers are more sought after by collectors in general than other covers. There are certain collectors that seek out Joker covers. And, you know, especially if you're going to be looking for Golden Age Batman, which is difficult to find. If you're going to focus on one type of Golden Age Batman, Joker covers are probably the way to go. But this also is interesting. It has the lowest average grade of the top 10 books at 4.35, which is pretty low, which means it tends to get graded in lower grades. People will still submit it for grading down to 2.0 and 1.0. Let's go to and there were 176 copies on the Census. Let's go to number 2, and it's another Joker cover 3 months later or 6 months later. Batman number 55, 3 issues later. Right, this is a Dick Sprang cover. A lot of stuff going on, right? Joker on the cover on this radio as Batman breaks in. There's a map in the background. Kind of intriguing, like what's really happening here. Battle their oldest enemy, state by state, in the case of the 48 Jokers. This is 1949. Prior to 1959, there were still 48 states then. And Joker front and center with, I'm not even sure, is that a... What's he got on his face? It almost looks at first glance like a milk carton. But, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what that is. You guys know? I don't know. Anyway, there are 202 copies on the Census. Now, number 1 spot is not Batman. It's not really Superman. It's a number 1 issue. It's Superboy, number 1. This is a Wayne Boring and Stan K cover where, interestingly, Superboy doesn't make the cover. It's Superman on the cover. And those you kids out there, at this point in time through Crisis on Infinite Earths, Superboy was Superman when he was a boy. So these stories were taking place, I guess, in the 1930s at this time. He had been appearing for, about 4 or 5 years in Adventure Comics by this point in time. And he finally got his own title. And it's kind of interesting because superheroes weren't getting their own number 1s at this point in time. They were closing down shop. Like Green Lantern was off the cover. Flash was already canceled. The Timely guys were about to be shown the door over there. So kind of unique. Now, there are 214 copies of this book on the Census. That gives it the number 1 spot. But there's also 58 restored copies, which is very large, about more than 25%. Of more than 25% of the number, the restored copies is more than 25% of the number of blue label copies. So there are a lot of copies out there. Again, this is 214 blue labels. That's the smallest number of blue labels to top the Census since 1939, in a decade. So there are fewer of them out there. It's going to be interesting to see how that continues into the 1950s, and maybe specifically how we kind of track superhero books compared to potentially pre-code horror or whatever else we see in the 1950s until we get to the Silver Age. But again, 214 blue labels on the Census of Superboy number 1. Now let's go to some other books, other publishers, is how and other keys is how I like to kind of sort the list, or bring in comics. And some of the great artists of the day, there's a triumvirate of them that are exceedingly popular. And we'll see some interesting number ones and first appearances as we go through the list. But let's go to number 14 on the list. And this is a book from Avon. It's Slave Girl Comics number 1. I think you might figure out why this is popular among collectors. Howard Larson cover. Again, a smaller publisher, not as well known, but the subject matter makes it collectible. And it's kind of surprising that there are this many copies that have been able to get graded. 99 on the census. Let's go to number 20, and it's another number 1 of an iconic character, a character that everybody knows. This is actually a very high census count from Archie. I think this is probably the, up to date, the most submitted Archie book from any year. It's Archie's Pal Jughead number 1. There are 88 copies on the census. It does have a mean grade of 4.53, which does mean when you're in the 4s at this point in time, lower grade copies are being graded. And, you know, maybe since it was in number 1, there was a higher print run. I don't know. But it's kind of interesting that Jughead number 1 makes it this high on the list, much higher on the list, and a total higher number of copies than any of the Archies we saw from previous years from Archie Comics or even Pep Comics. Let's go to, this is an iconic one, and it's an important one. This is Captain America Comics number 74, which on the cover reads as Captain America's Weird Tales. Right? Pre-code horror was coming in. This iconic red cover with Cap battling the Red Skull. The Red Skull actually takes front and center, is the main part of this cover by Martin Odell, who's better known earlier for Green Lantern. And this was the penultimate issue, and more Captain America's more just like a narrator of horror stories in this. Captain America's gone, right? Superheroics with Cap are a thing of the past. We'll see a little bit of a flare of him coming up in the 50s, but then we won't see him again until Avengers number 4 in superheroic form. But this is a highly sought after collectible comic. The average grade is 4.41, and there are 81 copies of this on the census. Another superhero, this is a little bit different vein. This is Wonder Woman number 37, which is the first appearance of Circe. Circe was recently featured in the Creature Commandos. Circe is a mythical character, so it's not like this is the first appearance of Circe. It's the first appearance of Circe in a DC comic book. I don't think she appeared in any other publishers, but anybody could use Circe, right? She's a mythological figure, Greek mythology, but she is a foil for Wonder Woman. This is an H.G. Peter cover. There are 79 copies on the census. The average grade on the census is 3.82. Now, Wonder Woman collectors of this era do exist, but we haven't seen Wonder Woman pop up in these numbers previously since, you know, we haven't really talked about Wonder Woman since, I think, the first appearance of Cheetah maybe on any of these lists. And this is graded in lower grade. 3.82 is a very low mean grade for 1949. So, again, this book is graded lower. I think it is because the first appearance of Circe more so than the cover. I don't think this cover is anything completely interesting, but it's the first appearance of Circe. And, again, there are 79 copies on the census. Let's go to our next book. Our next book is 34th on the list. It is from St. John Publications, Casper, the Friendly Ghost number 1. It was from St. John's. It wasn't from Harvey, who he would become known as. Casper, a long-running humor comic from Harvey, cartoons. He did originate in a series of cartoons, right? His first appearance in an animated cartoon was in 1945 from Paramount Pictures Studios. And then he finally got a comic book here in 1949. And what we'll see in terms of the popularity of comics, and this will be heightened after the Comics Code comes into authority, Funny Animals. You know, these are comedy books. Books aimed at younger kids, which parents could, by the late 50s, say, okay, Casper the Friendly Ghost is safe, right? Nothing could be safer than reading about a dead child. But it's the first appearance of Casper in comic books origin, and first appearance of Baby Huey and Herman the Mouse. Baby Huey also had their own title for a long while from Harvey Comics. Mean grade 4.42. Very collectible book. Casper, well-known character, movie in the 90s with Christina Ricci and everything. Total number of copies on the census is 58. 40th on the list. From Fox features, top Fox book of the year, JoJo Comics number 25, Matt Baker cover, bondage cover. Those two elements, gonna get it graded. We talk about Matt Baker, Alex Schomburg, and L.B. Cole as the three artists from this era that people really collect. And people are collecting it because of them as cover artists, because a lot of these books are from small publishers, and I think that their collectability has been even heightened since the slabs have become popular, because at this point in time, this is true pre-code horror as well. It's the cover that really sells this book. We don't really talk about what's inside. Whereas with the Wonder Woman book previously, the first appearance of Cersei is inside the book. And I think the Batman, the Superman, those superheroes that are ongoing, even Captain America, not so much maybe in the horror stories. People are interested in reading old stories of those, but the cover is what sells this from Matt Baker, and there are 50 copies on the census. Also from Fox Features Syndicate, very similar in style and tone, is another bondage cover in Phantom Lady number 23. Actually, this is a Jack Kamen cover. But it looks like he's doing his darn best to come up with a Matt Baker style cover. It didn't quite look like Baker to me. It's a Jack Kamen cover, but the bondage, the headlights, that's what sells it. 49 copies on the census. Let's go to another number one, and this is interesting. This is from Toby Press, their top book on the census. It's John Wayne Adventure Comics number 1, with a photo cover of John Wayne, who these are adventure comics, because you'll see there's, in this particular run, it kind of alternates between Western and war themes, which is most of the films that John Wayne made at that time. He was kind of between the two genres. I'm trying to think of other films that he did by this point in time. He did do some other, like the Genghis Khan film later on, and obviously he did do a few more dramas as he got later in his career, but he really was a lot of Westerns, a lot of war. Best known for those roles. He won his Academy Award for True Grit, playing the character Rooster Cogburn, which was a Western, but a very popular actor of the time for those kids that are unfamiliar. And there are 49 copies on the census. Another publisher, this is a publisher we talked about before, KK Comics, March of Comics, number 41. And this is a Walt Kelly cover of Donald Duck with one of his nephews. These are, I believe, they're reprints of other stories, because, you know, Dell was publishing the Donald Duck stories in 4-color, Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, all those were from Dell. But this is from KK, and there are 47 copies on the census. Up next, 52nd place on the list from Better Publications is Thrilling Comics, with this airbrushed cover by Alex Schomburg. And I don't know, yeah, you can see it, if you look, you got to look very closely. In the bottom left of the corner is his Zela signature, which is Alex spelled backwards, Xela. He started doing that pretty much after World War II, when he started doing these airbrush covers. And we've also talked about before how the Schomburg covers, his World War II covers, largely for Timely, were very busy. A lot going on. Much more minimalist here. Again, 4 characters on the cover. Usually it's a damsel in distress. Here, the man's in distress. The antagonists and the hero coming to save the day. A little bit of a switch here, where it's the guy trussed up, and maybe the woman's going to... Well, actually, she's going to make him her slave, maybe? She's pointing to have him put down in front of her. That is quite salacious for 1949. And this also includes Frank Frazetta art. Now, I should say, and I've been remiss in talking about this in previous videos, CGC will attribute these to different publishers, but essentially there were 4 imprints for the same publisher. This is from Better Publications. There's also Nidor Publishing, there's Standard Comics, and there's Pines Comics. All of them were imprints from Ned Pines, who is a publisher of comic books as well as pulps at this point in time. And a lot of characters. Schomburg did a lot of work across those. I don't really put them all together on these lists because usually it's fun to look at the ones under the Nidor or Standard banner as well. So for our next book, superheroes are going away. Let's go back to DC Comics. It is Flash Comics 104, the final issue of the series. After 9 years, Flash Comics gets canceled. He had been alternating on the cover with Hawkman, I think, with maybe 2 exceptions. Flash was on the cover in the odd issues, Hawkman in the even, this being an even issue. This cover by Joe Kubert. The origin of Flash is retold, but not in time. It's just time to go goodbye. This is a really cool cover with Hawkman on the cover. And again, it's the last issue of the series. They did continue the numbering when Barry Allen got his own series about a decade later, and where it was just Flash. This is Flash Comics, and it's the final issue of the series. So there's still a couple of superhero titles holding on that would eventually be canceled, and we'll talk about those. There are 44 copies of this on the Census. Up next is another Better publication. This is another Alex Schomburg cover, and another airbrush cover. And you can see there's it's the same woman, I think, that we had previously. She's fighting off a tiger, and you have this young Indian boy in the background. An airbrushed cover by Alex Schomburg. We needed 44 copies to make the Census. Let's go to the next book on their list, and this is the top book from Quality Comics, and it's Torchy #1 with a Gil Fox cover. Torchy had premiered in an issue of Dollman Comics, and it was really Quality is probably, in retrospect at least, best known for their superhero titles: Plastic Man, Black Hawk, Dollman, a lot of other, Uncle Sam, The Spirit, a lot of other books that survived because DC did buy it. The GI Combat was a book they bought and continued publishing it. They brought these characters back as the Freedom Fighters, but Torchy was quite popular at the time. There are lingerie panels, and this has 42 copies on the Census. Let's go to another Matt Baker cover from Fox Features. This is All Top Comics, and it does have Rula, JoJo, and Phantom Lady stories. I'm never quite sure this is Rula, JoJo, but this octopus cover, exceedingly popular, kind of underwater theme. She is underwater because there are air bubbles coming out, and she's fighting off this giant octopus. Again, talking about Matt Baker, he did a lot of his work at this point in time for Fox, and those are the books that are coming in. There are 41 copies of this in a blue label. Let's go to a first appearance, and this is from Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies. This is issue number 91, and it's the first comic book appearance of Wile E. Coyote as Kelsey Cody. I don't think it's the first appearance of Roadrunner. That is later. Yeah, Roadrunner wouldn't have his first appearance in a comic book until 1958. And this kind of predates the first appearance of Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner in film, which was later in 1949. So this is kind of a prototype of Wile E. Coyote that I guess they were working on. But we don't see a lot of Looney Tunes books pop up. They're under the Dell banner, so it seems the Carl Barks stories at this point in time, the Donald Duck Disney stuff, kind of outpaces that and takes a spot on the list, but there are 39 copies of this book on the Census. At 69th place is another Alex Schomburg cover. This is from Nidor Publications, which of course is pretty much the same as Better and Standard. This is Exciting Comics, number 66, Alex Schomburg cover, airbrushed cover, and just again another classic cover. I really like the colors on this one. This is a really cool cover. And again, minimalist in terms of the number of characters. And just like a white background. There's not a lot going on in the background. In the bottom there is. Yeah, Schomburg seemed to kind of have a different style than he did during World War II. As we've said, there are 38 copies of this on the Census, which ties it with Captain Marvel Adventures number 100. This is the first superhero book to reach 100 issues, I believe. Although Action would have. Action and Detective and Adventure would have, by this point in time, been at issue 100. Wiz probably not yet. Wasn't there. But the first solo titled book, which is Captain Marvel Adventures, got there well before Superman or Batman. And that's what makes this popular. This silver metallic cover is pretty cool. And it's a C.C. Beck cover and art. And they retell, once again, they did it the previous year, the origin of Captain Marvel. There are, just like the Exciting Comics, there are 38 copies on the Census. Up next, we talked about this book before. It's used in Seduction of the Innocent. It's Classics Illustrated number 43, but this is HRN 62. Now, what HRN refers to for Classics Illustrated books, it's the highest reorder number. So these books had multiple printings. The first printing of this was on a previous list. This is the top book, and it's still pretty high up there. There are a lot of Classics Illustrated books out there because either parents thought they were educational and wanted their kids to read them, or kids had to read them for school and would rather read the comic book than the novel. At any rate, this was used in Seduction of the Innocent. The HRN number, the highest reorder number, which means on the back cover, you would have a list of all the books that you would be able to order that have already been printed by Classics Illustrated. So HRN 62 means it goes up to issue 62. So 19 issues past this particular one, this particular book's first printing, are 19 more issues. So this did make the Census despite being a reprint, and there are 37 copies on the Census, which ties it with our next book, which is Sad Sack number 1. Sad Sack this is from Harvey. This is the top Harvey book of the year. He first came to comic strips in 1942 as a private in the Army, kind of a hapless one. But by this point in time, he got his own book in 1949, and he was a civilian at this point in time. He would re-up in the Army because these stories probably didn't work as well. He is loved by millions, though. And this book would run all the way until 1982, 270 issues of Sad Sack. Are there people out there that collect all 287 issues? Boy, that would be challenging. I'm pretty sure there are at least a couple of Sad Sack collectors. Imagine trying to collect all that in the wild. That would be amazing. This is a George Baker cover. He is the creator of Sad Sack. And this is not his first comic book appearance. That was, I think, True Comics 55. There are 37 copies on the Census. Let's go to the next book, which is a Jack Kamen cover of Phantom Lady, a similar pose to the other Phantom Lady book on this list. This is Phantom Lady number 22 from Fox Features Syndicate, and there are 34 copies on the list. The next one is an interesting one. This is a top book from Magazine Enterprises. It's a photo cover, The Pride of the Yankees, The Life of Lou Gehrig. This is 10 years after his retirement. Lou Gehrig, a historical baseball player for the New York Yankees, at one point held the record for most consecutive games played of 2,130, is, I think, almost universally still considered the greatest first baseman of all time. Batted behind Babe Ruth for much of his career. There was a movie in 1942, The Pride of the Yankees, starring... I'm drawing a blank... There's a movie in 1942 starring Gary Cooper, which was a great movie. A Gardner Fox story and Ogden Whitney art, which means that this is, I imagine, a comic book title. There are 32 copies on the Census. Let's go to another number one of a humor title, and that is from St. John Publications. We've already seen St. John come out with Casper. This is Three Stooges number 1. It's the first appearance of the Three Stooges in comics. They were in movie shorts going back to the 1930s with Moe, Larry, and Shemp. Shemp eventually replaced by Curly. And exceedingly popular. This is a Norman Maurer cover and Joe Kubert art inside. So that is Three Stooges, very popular, 30 copies on the census. What about our good old friends at EC Comics? We're not into horror yet. Once again, the top EC book is Moon Girl. This is issue number 6, Sheldon Moldoff cover. Very much a superheroic science fiction based story. I don't really know much about Moon Girl. Nobody's ever has everybody ever reprinted Moon Girl stories? They look kind of cool in that kind of this new superhero when superheroes were dying out. It does look more science fiction based than a lot of other of the superhero books at the time. This 30 copies on the census. Let's go to some romance. Another St. John's book. This is Teenage Romances number 1, Matt Baker cover. The romance genre was fairly new, but we can see that it is increasing in popularity at this point in time. In this issue, I was 17 years old and was a high school senior. Was I too young for love? Romance is growing in popularity, and the bigger covers are especially popular. There are 29 copies on the census. Next, top book from Novelty Press. This is an L.B. Cole cover, Guns Against Gangsters number 6. This really cool underwater cover by L.B. Cole with this, I think that's a killer whale, not a shark attacking this woman. I don't know what that has to do with gangsters. There are no gangsters on the cover. There's just a woman with a knife and an orca. That's kind of curious. There are, top from Novelty Press, there are 28 copies on the census. Thrilling, which is kind of similar to the other titles. This is actually Thrilling / Nidor. It's listed as Nidor here. Actually, in the CGC data site, it's listed as Thrilling. But this is Exciting Comics number 65. Alex Schomburg, airbrushed cover, Jungle Girl theme, and we can see, again, just 4 characters on the cover. There are 26 copies on the census, which ties it with the top book from American Comics Group. This is Adventures into the Unknown number 3. It is a Edvard Moritz cover. Adventures into the Unknown, a little bit of an early horror title, and American Comics Group, this was, probably their biggest title at the time. There are 26 copies on the census. How about McCombs? Where is that? Well, actually, it's listed here as Harvey. I've seen it also listed as McCombs. This is a Bob Powell art. I don't think he did the cover. This is True Love Problems and Advice Illustrated number 1. So there's somebody at reception. Yes, moment, Bill. Yes, I'll be free tonight after all. Jane, why don't you answer? Is anything wrong? I guess she's upset this guy is with that girl, and the guy who's calling her for a date doesn't really matter. Am I too young to marry? Too young for love in the other book, too young for marry for this one. What every girl should know. True Love Problems and Advice Illustrated number 1. 25 copies on the census. This is an interesting one. This is the top book from Commercial Comics. And this is the first comic book appearance of Smokey Bear. Not Smokey the Bear. Smokey Bear. He has no middle name. And he was first appeared in 1944. And it was a campaign by the U.S. Forest Service to prevent wildfires, which kind of ironic that we're talking about that with everything. If you're watching this later, I'm recording this as there are still fires burning throughout Los Angeles. But Smokey Bear was a mascot that was part of the campaign to prevent forest fires. And he had his first comic book appearance. This was a public service announcement comic, I guess is the best way to phrase it. American Forestry Association promotional giveaway, first appearance of Smokey the Bear. Back cover indicates 1950, but it does have a 1949 cover date according to what CGC puts as it. So that's how we'll talk about it. So yeah, Forest Fire number 1. 24 copies on the census. Up next, from Will Eisner Publications, and we have a Will Eisner cover here. This is Baseball Comics number 1. it looks like fictional stories in baseball as opposed to like the life of Lou Gehrig or whatever. There are 22 copies of this on the Census. It's tied with the top book from Superior Comics, which has a Jack Kamen cover and L.B. Cole interior art, and it's Ellery Queen #1. Ellery Queen was actually a pseudonym created by two writers to write kind of pulp stories. It was like Ellery Queen wrote all these stories, but it was really Frederick Danae and Manfred Bennington Lee who wrote the stories, and it was the name of their fictional detective. So they published these novels and short stories starting in 1929, and he finally came to comic books here in 1949. There was a radio show starting in 1939. There was a TV show that came out starting in 1940, starring Richard Hart and later Lee Bowman. There's another syndicated series in 1954, another one on NBC in 1958, the TV movie in 1971 with Peter Lawford, and finally, what I remember is a TV movie and TV series in the mid-70s starring Jim Hutton and David Wayne. David Wayne, to you nerds, better known as Mad Hatter from the Batman '66 series. But that's a lot about Ellery Queen, and Jack Kamen cover with this kind of gruesome skull-ringed hand. And this has 22 copies on the Census. Also, with the same number, Headline Comics #1. This is the top from Prize Publications. It's a Jack Kirby photo cover, so I believe that's Jack Kirby on the cover. That kind of looks like him, right? It says Jack Kirby photo cover. It's got Jack Kirby, John Severin, Vic Donahue, Joe Simon, and John Bell art inside. So this also has 22 copies on the Census. Up next, the top from Novelty Press. Is this the top? No, it's not the top from Novelty Press. They had the Guns Against Gangsters. But this is another classic cover by L.B. Cole. This is Target Comics Volume 9, number 12. Also with 22 copies on the Census. Finally breaking that tie, or not, is... yes. This is another St. John's publication. Mean grade of only 4.57. It's Blue Ribbon Comics #2 with a Matt Baker cover. It's titled Blue Ribbon Comics, but it looks like Diary Secrets. And these romance books by Matt Baker. Very collectible, but only 19 copies of this. From Youthful Magazines, the top book from them is Gunsmoke #1, which stars a guy named Gunsmoke, a Western hero, not to be confused with the Gunsmoke radio program, later TV series, which in TV starred James Arness. But this is Gunsmoke and the Masked Marvel. There are just 18 copies of this on the Census. I have a low-grade copy that I have around here somewhere that I just got in a collection of issue #1. So, let's keep going. Up next is America's Best Comics #31 from Standard. This has an Alex Schomburg cover. It does include superheroes Black Terror and Miss Mask on the cover. And, of course, they're spending their superheroic time working at the circus with lions and tigers. Oh, my. There are 18 copies of this on the Census. From another one's from St. John's, another Matt Baker cover. This is Giant Comics Editions #12, which also seems to be Diary Secrets. 25 center, so it's a larger book. Classic cover by Matt Baker. There are 16 copies on the Census. The mean grade of this is 4.13. And since it is a 25 cent, I believe it's a square-bound book, you're going to get spine splits on that and have lower grades. But it's a Matt Baker cover, coveted by collectors. Top book from Street and Smith is Shadow Comics Volume 9, number 5. Bob Powell art with a skull cover. The Shadow, a popular radio character in pulps, and he had a long-running comic book. He's had other comic books over the years, including the Michael Kaluta run in the 70s in DC. Now, this is an interesting one next. This is from Prize Publications. Simon and Kirby cover. Young Love #1 by the editors of Young Romance, one of these early romance books. Young Love and Young Romance, Prize Publications folded into something else. These were eventually bought by DC, and these titles continued into the 1970s under the DC banner. But this early Simon and Kirby, just 15 copies on the Census. Up next from Hillman Periodicals is Airboy Comics Volume 6, Number 1. I'm trying to read this on my screen and it's slow. David Zolner-Owich cover. Airboy, a pretty popular character, had a revival in the 80s from Eclipse Comics, but there are just 14 copies of this on the Census. Up next, and this is interesting. This is Blonde Phantom number 22 from Timely Comics. This has a Charles Nicholas cover. Blonde Phantom, there's been talk that Taylor Swift is going to star as Blonde Phantom in a Disney Plus series. I don't know where that rumor came from, but it's kind of been propagated. This is the final issue. And there is an editorial, and it says on the label, an anti-Wortham editorial. Editorial against Frederick Wortham, who was writing about the dangers of comic books at the time. Stan Lee did publish an editorial in the 60s refuting Wortham's work, saying, Wortham, basically, here's the problem. And I talk about this in my high school statistics class. Wortham talked about working with juvenile delinquents and how he found that 85% of them read comic books. I think that was the number. 85%. So he said comic books are causing juvenile delinquency. Stan Lee rebutted and said that 85% of all kids at this point in time are reading comic books. So you didn't do a proper study to compare comic books of juvenile delinquents to that of the general population. So there's no basis to draw a conclusion there. And Wortham's logic was flawed. So at any rate, again, the last issue of the series, Timely Superheroes going away. A main grade of just 4.71, 14 copies on the Census. Crime Detective Comics from Hillman. You see this psychiatrist on the cover who's bound and gagged. He's M. Brown, psychiatrist, but that is really a cartoon caricature of Frederick Wortham on the cover. There are, again, 14 copies on the Census, mean grade 4.59. From DS Publishing, Exposed, number 6, a Graham Engels cover. This also used in Seduction of the Innocent. Cases in the Crusade Against Crime. Looks like they're at a masquerade ball. There are 13 copies on the Census. From Eastern Color, Famous Funnies number 176. This book had been around since ever. We saw a lot of this book in like the Platinum era stuff because it was the only thing that was around. They're already up to issue 176 in 1949. A Stephen Douglas cover. It's a cutesy little humor title. There are 13 copies on the Census. This is the one. This is another standard book. This is Black Terror number 27. Another Alex Schomburg cover featuring Black Terror. He's in the Old West, evidently. Introducing Buck Ranger, the Cowboy Detective. There are 12 copies on the Census. The Fighting Yank, another Schomburg cover from Nidor, Standard Pines, whatever you want to call it. There are 12 copies on the Census. This one, not airbrushed. Johnny Hazard, number 7. This is from Pines, a Frank Robbins cover. And it's a pretty, I like the colors on this one. There are also 12 copies on the Census. From St. John's, another Matt Baker cover of Romance and Confession Stories number 1. So that's her game. First she lied to me about Bob. Now she's lying to him about me. I'll fix her. Matt Baker, and it's another 25 center, thicker book. There are 12 copies on the Census. From David McKay Publishing, I couldn't even find a picture of a slabbed copy. This is feature book number 56, starring The Phantom. Feature book goes all the way back to the 30s. They featured the newspaper reprints of a different character each issue. There are 11 copies on the Census. From Ace Periodicals, their top book, the Sid Green art, does have skulls on the cover, skull masks. This is Super Mystery Comics, Volume 8, Number 4, 11 copies on the Census. And then one of the top publishers of the time, Boy Comics, Daredevil Comics in the 1940s, was Lev Gleason. They would last about 5 more years, I think. Their top book is a 3-way tie. It's Black Diamond Western, number 9, a Charles Biro cover. And that is tied with Crime Does Not Pay, number 74, another Charles Bureau cover. George Tuska and Fred Gardner art inside. And in a three-way tie, another Charles Bureau cover. And this is kind of interesting. It's a little different style for him. This is Lover's Lane, number 1. No relation to Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, number 1, which is about 9 years down the road. They're getting into the romance department. All three of these have just 8 copies on the Census. So that's going to do it for 1949. Fewer books submitted from this year. It's kind of a lull in collecting. We're not even to pre-code horror yet. That's going to be about another 2 years, and it'll be interesting to see what the top book ends up being from 1950. But I hope you are enjoying this list. I'm having fun putting it out. Give it a like. You know, help the algorithm find more viewers. I think people will be interested in this. I appreciate the comments. Thank you for stopping by. You can take a look at a couple of my other videos here. And this is Jim saying until next time, enjoy your comics.